We'd like to start today's session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to extend our respects to elders past and present. Today we're discussing racism in Australia, a country that shortly after Federation passed a white Australian policy in resistance to Asian and Pacific Islander labourers, a policy that only officially ended in the mid-70s. It's also a country that didn't officially count all Indigenous Australians in its national human population until 1967. And it's a country where some are insisting right now that it be reclaimed. But reclaimed from what and from whom? To discuss all these questions and more are our guests today. So right at the end, Abdul Abdullah is an artist who works across many platforms and media. His paintings have been finalists in the Archibald Prize twice, and his works are collected in galleries across Australia, and his practice explores the experience of the other in society and of young Muslims in contemporary multicultural Australia. Next to him, we've got Dr. Gregory Phillips, who's from the Wanyi peoples, and he's a medical anthropologist with a master's in medical science and a PhD in psychology. In his 20 years of working in the health, youth and medical sector, he's developed an accredited Indigenous health curriculum for medical schools in Australia and New Zealand, written a national health workforce strategy, and established the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Healing Foundation. Next to Dr. Gregory, we've got Nakkiah Lui, who's a Gamilaroi Torres Strait Islander, writer and actor. She's a co-writer and star of ABC TV's Black Comedy, Australia's first Indigenous sketch comedy show in over 4 decades. And as a playwright, she's been an artist in residence at both Griffin and Belvoir theatres, and her work has won numerous awards. And next to me, we've got Voranai Vanijaka, who's the editor-in-chief at GQ magazine in Thailand. He also teaches political communication and intercultural communication at Thammasat University, and between 2008 and 2014, he was an award-winning political commentator with the Bangkok Post. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Now, the title of this session is interesting. It's When is Australia Racist? I thought we'd start with the non-Australian first. Now, Voranai, Thais and Australians are very familiar with each other in many ways. So 600,000 Australians visited Thailand last year. It's the 4th most visited country for Australians, and there are over 50,000 Australians with Thai heritage. So I'm curious, how is Australia regarded by Thais? Are we seen as a welcoming country, a racist country, or a bit of both?
Well, for example, if we Thai were to look on this panel and we would see no Australian.
So you're saying that the idea of
Australia is an Anglo-Saxon white country. That's the perspective of a non-Australian, especially ones from a developing country rather than from Europe or from America. Now, as far as racism in Australia, I guess from an outsider perspective, it depends on who represents your country. If Pauline Hanson was the Prime Minister, would Australia be racist? What about John Howard? Or whoever you got as Prime Minister right now, I don't even remember, sorry.
It's been too many.
But in my experience with Australians, which hasn't been many, I have never dated an Australian woman. I'm working on that. But in Thailand, we are, of course, very familiar with Australians. There are a lot of Australians tourists in Thailand and also the expat communities. And I guess it's the same with each different community. There are the good ones and there are the bad ones. There are the sex tourists and sexpats that we affectionately call them, and there are plenty of them are Australians, and I guarantee you, every Christmas and New Year's, if I were to be driving on the street in the wee hour in the morning because I just got back from some party or something, I would see bodies of white people laying on the street, passed out drunk, and we Thais in the car would look at them and say, these white people. and lots of them would be Australians, but
so we're sort of seen as sort of can be sloppy tourists sometimes. Is that fair to say?
That is quite fair to say, but to be very racist about it, right now you're being outdone by the Chinese.
Yeah. Represent. You know that point that you make before about, if Thais were to look at this panel, which is a distinctly non-white Australian panel, and think, well, that doesn't look like Australia. Is that more a misperception of the Thais of how multicultural we are, or is it the case that Australia doesn't export an image of itself as a multicultural country, that we don't market ourselves that way?
It's a bit of both. I mean, everything is your perception, what you see, and what we see and what we know of Australia is Hugh Jackman and Kate Blanchett and
beautiful white people.
The beautiful white people, and we watch rugby. And we see the Australian team, and there are colored people on it, but still not that many. But as far as real life Australians in Bangkok, in Thailand, I have yet to see one that is an Anglo-Saxon. And this is me. I'm an international kind of guy. I grew up in the States. I have an international perspective. Now just imagine a real Thai, local Thai, looking at Australia. What would he or she think? He or she would definitely see only white. And would be surprised to see colours.
Yeah, so that expectation that even though, say, 1 in 10 Australians has Asian background, the idea of white Australia is very firmly fixed in people's minds. It reminds me, I met a Chinese lady in Beijing, and she said, I remember coming to Australia like years ago, and in Sydney, there were so many Australians of so many different colours. I was very disappointed. Hey, I'm going to throw it over to the Australians on the panel. Now, Interrobang is a festival of questions, right? And often the question when we have thrown at us when we're talking about racism and race is Australia a racist country? Is that the right question to be asking?
No, I think we should work on the premise. I mean, given the history of Australia, from 1788 when they came here with their tall ships and took a look at us and shot us. Well, that was rather bleak. I went there rather fast, didn't I? But it's given that this country is founded on the bloodshed of black people, I would say that the question is, when is Australia racist? And then the responsibility then falls on all of us marginalised groups to justify our existence and our lived experience. It should be, when isn't Australia racist?
Now, Nakkiah and Greg, you're both Indigenous Australians. Abdul, you're 7th generation Australian, descended from convict blood. So all of you, in your own way, are super Australian. But I imagine there have been periods in each of your lives where you've been made to feel unwelcome in your own country. Is that fair to say? And what have those experiences been, Abdul?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I can feel there was a definite shift in mentality after 9/11, pre the War on Terror and afterwards. Like, prior to that, there was always like a certain experience of racism, personal experience, and entirely and mostly through my mother, who's a brown-skinned Malay woman. But after 9/11, when you couldn't open a newspaper, turn on the television, or listen to the radio without being reminded that you were the bad guy, that you were unwelcome, and that you represented in the popular imagination some type of existential threat.
It's interesting. I remember reading like an essay that was about London before and after the 9/11 attacks and their own attacks in London later on, and it was like a lot of Muslim British people talked about, well, we've always been stereotypes, but before those really huge moments of terrorism, the stereotype that we were obedient nerds. And now the stereotype has shifted to this other extreme, which is like, you're not obedient nerds anymore. Did you sort of find that in terms of how people saw you before and after? How did it shift?
I can understand that and appreciate that. Like when I go to Malaysia, I still kind of see obedient nerds. That's a terrible way of talking about
Don't
my
worry, people
family,
see me as an obedient nerd as well.
But growing up as a Muslim for me it also meant in the community that I was growing up in, being brown and poor, and that was a common experience. Being brown and poor was as much being a Muslim as anything else, and we were all sort of on the fringe anyway in a migrant community. So I wouldn't say it was more of a rough neighbourhood.
Now, what about Greg and Nakkiah? You know, your backgrounds are First People Australians as well. Have you ever been made to feel like you're not supposed to belong here? Have you ever been told to go back to where you came from?
Yeah, on the train in Brisbane. But that sort of stuff happens. Look, I think the question really is, what is racism? And how does that happen? I mean, of course Australia is racist because we have not addressed colonisation or genocide properly. And so therefore the power structures remain. And while Australia is multicultural in terms of ethnic makeup, we're still racist because the White Australia policy still prevails in terms of who has power and who makes decisions and who keeps resources. So it's really about how you define racism. I don't think racism is actually just about ethnicity or skin colour or perceptions of superiority, inferiority. It's about the values that go with that. The deeper implicit values of whiteness, which in my mind are not just about race and ethnicity, but are also about neoliberalism. So that you can come to Australia and be welcomed here if you're a migrant who is prepared to accept white values about money and power structure. But if you talk your language and culture proudly in public, then you're hammered for it. But if, on the other hand, you keep your language and culture at home and in public society, for all intents and purposes, assimilate, then you're an acceptable sort of darkie. But if you don't do that, then you're not an acceptable sort of darkie. So the question is actually not when is Australia racist, it's how is Australia racist.
Nakkiah, have you had personal experiences that you can share with us in terms of when you've been made to feel un-Australian or that
How
you don't
long
belong here?
do you have?
Got the next half hour.
No, but I mean, I've never felt Australian. I wouldn't call myself an Australian.
How do you identify first and foremost?
I identify as Aboriginal, but I also wonder if I'm that. Because Aboriginal people were never Aboriginal until a white person came and said, you're Aboriginal. You know, our identity is far more complex than that. So even in that sense, the label of Aboriginality is quite erasing. But I don't consider myself Australian, and I never did. And I mean, it's partly, you know, like my parents, when they were born in Australia, they weren't considered people. They were, you know, classified as animals, you know. My mother was a fringe dweller. You know, my father had to have a cultural adoption because of a love affair between his mother, who was toe straight, and his father, who was Asian. So it's that idea of being Australian for me is not something where I ever felt I fit in. You know, it was always you're Aboriginal, first and foremost. And, you know, I remember I spoke about this earlier today, I used to climb this tree out the front of my nan's house and yell, I'm a little Koori girl, I'm a little black girl, in like my little Aboriginal swimsuit. I should say I was about 4 at the time. This wasn't like a recent event. And and I used to yell this out. And I was so proud of the fact that I was Aboriginal. It was such a big part of my identity. And then I went to school and then I started getting called Abo. You know, and then that went on to university where I was the Aboriginal student. And look how great it is that, you know, you've come this far. And, you know, now as an artist, I'm an Aboriginal artist. And my biggest criticisms have been, and the most racist ones have been from white men who've criticised my work on the basis of my Aboriginality. You know, I'm never considered an Australian. So the only thing Australian about me would be my passport.
So, interestingly, you see yourself first and foremost as Aboriginal.
Well, I see myself first and foremost as black, even though, you know, I'm pretty pale. It's because Aboriginal people are the furthest away from white you can be in this country, and they were black. So that's what I consider myself as.
And similarly, it sounds like a lot of people, and especially a lot of critics, for instance, would see you first and foremost as black as well, but in a whole other context, or they problematise the fact that they see you black first and foremost. Okay, I want to get back to a question that you sort of raised earlier, Dr. Greg, which was what is racism? And I wonder if you might be able to answer that from a political science background. What is racism, or what is racism's plural? Because I imagine there's many types, aren't there?
I think racism has become, well, it hasn't become, it has always been a negative concept. Let me just share some personal experience. I lived in Texas for 10 years, and they thought I was Mexican and I've been called wetback. I lived in England for a year and they thought I was Pakistani and they called me Paki. So my feeling was like, if you're going to be a racist, at least get it right. I'm neither. But racism stems from tribalism. That's human nature. We get together as a group, like attract like. We organize as a tribe 7,000 years ago. And through competition with other tribes, we have this us versus them mentality. then we see the differences in languages, in skin colors, in customs, in culture, so on and so forth. It's us versus them. That's basically it. It's human nature in a world of scarce resource where we have to compete. Now, racism in today's world, in the modern world, we see it as the white folks against everyone else. The reason for that is basically this. Because the white folks won, everyone else lost. This modern world system is a Western concept that was created through colonialism. Basically, they kick our asses. That's it. That's all it is. So you have the white man with the power and everyone else. Now, I think it's important to recognize that, because otherwise we just keep vilifying the West and the white folks. That's why, for example, it's a panel about racism in Australia, not one white person on here. So there's such a thing as reverse racism. But in my own personal experience, I do believe in multiculturalism. I mean, I grew up in Texas. You don't get any more racism in Texas, right? And at first, I went to a Baptist school. I was 12. I couldn't speak English. I was Buddhist. And they stuck me in a Southern Baptist school full of white kids. And you're a brown Buddhist. What do you do? So it was tough at first. But the wonderful thing about, I guess, American culture is that all you have to do, play sport, join the team, be a part of the group, become one with them. Suddenly you play in the same sport. Suddenly you start scoring goals for your team. Suddenly you are part of this group. You become teammates. And they don't see you as the brown Buddhist anymore. You become one of the guys. And I think through interaction, multicultural activities, talking to each other, exchanging ideas, doing things together, that's how you can best overcome this racism that we have today. But that doesn't mean you have to open the floodgate to every single refugee.
Well, that's something that we'll definitely talk about.
That's something we'll get to.
That's definitely something we'll talk about. Just touching on your point about being raised, being educated in Texas and being an ethnic minority there, did that change the way you thought about yourself as a Thai person? For instance, as opposed to growing up Thai in Thailand, you recognise and acknowledge that you're a Thai person. Did it make you think differently about your culture, your nationality, yourself?
Well, that's a good question, because the thing is, at 12 years old, I did not have an identity. I was too young to develop one. And even today, I don't have one because, like in Texas, I was Mexican. In London, I was Pakistani. In Thailand, people don't think of me as Thai because I don't look Thai. I don't act Thai. I don't speak the way the Thai people do. People look at me and they see us, I'm probably a half-breed or from somewhere else. So I can be a minority wherever I go. But the thing is, a lot of time, racism is about who you are within yourself, your own inner insecurities or your issues with other people. If you don't let that get to you, then to me, I don't have a problem with it. If people are racist towards me, I shrug it off, I go like this, and I move on with my life.
Did you have something
I
to
have
say
to
there,
respectfully disagree. Racism is not just about race or about ethnicity. The premise that all cultures are racist in a sense, so people grab onto that as, oh, well, everybody does it, it's okay. Actually, that's not true. Many earth cultures, in my experience, actually are very respectful of others and difference. And there are many cultures on earth who don't see difference as a threat to one's own sense of identity or purpose. But this is my point, is I don't think racism is just about ethnicity, it's about a set of values. There is no such thing as reverse racism. Reverse racism presumes that there is egalitarianism to start with. And there's not. There's not an equal playing field, particularly in Australia, in terms of who has power and who makes decisions, who controls the levers of power. So, because if you were to logically follow your point through, that an Aboriginal person could just turn up to a cricket team, for example, and play cricket and then be accepted like everybody else. That's actually not the case, because they might be on a personal level treated well and they might have that rapport with each other, and that's a great thing. But that doesn't mean that there's no racism in society, because when that person then goes to hail a cab after the cricket game, they can't get one. Or when it comes to Parliament and who makes decision about native title laws, for example, or what native title is, or how should land rights be accepted into the body politic, that's not Aboriginal people making the decision. And it's not just because Aboriginal people don't have capacity to be in Parliament, it's because the playing field and the settings of society are set in a way that they can never get there, or that it's much harder. So there's actually no such thing as reverse racism in my analysis. What there is whiteness and a set of values, and whiteness is not ethnicity, and it's not...
I call it whiteness with a capital W.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not about white skin or black skin or ethnicity, it's about a particular set of values that are about superiority and about neoliberalism as normal.
I mean, just to pick up on your point about the gatekeepers who are making the decisions, because I imagine, like, if we were discussing land title and there was a judge who was Aboriginal making those decisions, people would criticise that decision and say, well, obviously there are biases in place, but we don't think of whiteness as biased, right? Is that fair to say?
Well, because whiteness is invisible. You know, we have chats about racism, right? And exactly, we have a panel about when is Australia racist with not a single white person. So what happens is white supremacy sits at the centre of all of these decisions we make, and yet it becomes invisible. And that's when it's at its most dangerous, because we're not deconstructing the whiteness that is the value system, and then we're all just trying to assimilate into being this idea of what success is. And it becomes multiculturalism then, or race then becomes about assimilation.
Yeah. And see, black people can have whiteness, right? Any culture can have this particular set of values about whiteness, which is a particular belief that, for example, science is rational and non-objective or non-subjective, that it's objective, that there is such a thing as inequality in society, and that's kind of just normal now because there's always going to be the haves and have-nots. Those particular values are powerful cultural beliefs that are not universal. They're about capitalism unfettered. And you can't separate that from notions of racial superiority.
Well, I think we get caught... we get caught up a lot in the symptoms of racism. Like when we look at a guy with a swastika tattoo at the Reclaim Australia rallies, or the crap that Pauline Hanson says, or the stuff that's on morning television, but without looking at structural racism and how that's set up. There are, racism is top down, it's trickle down, it's the people in power, and these people parrot those opinions. But yeah, talking about globalisation and that sort of thing, globalisation, the capitalism requires exploitation of people to make things cheap, and acquisition of land and that sort of stuff, like minerals in this country. And how come Aboriginal people aren't living like Arab sheiks? It's mineral from their land. So, and we're all sort of implicit in an occupation. I'm kind of talking in circles, but what I'm saying, it's the people at the top, man.
Voranai, did you have something to add?
Let me just pick up on that. I agree and I disagree with the point about racism being there's reverse racism or not. First, I agree with racism is not just about skin color, of course, it's about values and a host of other issues. But also, by the same token, I mean, I have personally witnessed minority groups and gangs beating up white people just because of their skin color. So to me, there is reverse racism. And the point about a culture that doesn't have racism, I would like to know which culture that is. Can you name one that doesn't?
Well, there's discrimination. There's reverse discrimination, but there's not reverse racism, because racism is about power. It's not about race.
And when there's a group of, let's say, colored people beating up a white person, which group has the power?
That's about reverse discrimination or reverse abuse, and sure, that happens between all different races in society, but that's not reverse racism in my view.
Okay, so I think we're arguing semantic here, because at the end of the day, it's hatred. It's fear and hatred and violence. And I think every race, creed, and breed are capable of that.
Sure.
So I don't want to put that as exclusively belonging to one group of people. However, I would still say that because the white folks won, it seems that it comes more from them. And of course it does, because they have the power.
But
I don't think white folks won, by the way. But
if it does then, if to follow through on that, if white people did win, right, then we're, and I think that's a really interesting point. What then happens, right? And if we're going to be really honest about this, and we go, white people won, let's look at Australia, then the next question is, everybody else has to get over it. What then do you do? and in terms of indigeneity, in terms of Aboriginal people in this country, if white people won, do you then go, okay, let's acknowledge the fact we're living on stolen land, let's acknowledge the fact that this group of Indigenous people are supremely disadvantaged to the rest of the country, right? Do you acknowledge that? Do you give reparations? What type of tangible action do you do? And the issue with Australia is, when is Australia racist, is that Australia lives in a myth where it's neither one or the other. And I think that's a massive problem.
Yeah, I mean, white folks won what is the question then, I guess. One, colonisation, one, power and control of lands and, the myth of racial superiority. Perhaps you could say that's winning. But if Western science and religion and power, military power, was winning, what are they winning at? Because it's not working.
Well, it is for them.
It's actually not working for them. It's working for their bank balance, perhaps. But what they're doing is self-destructing, and they're taking the rest of us with it. So it's actually not winning anything at all. It's winning destruction of the planet and self. If you're talking about winning, winning is about which cultures on earth have an innate respect for others' humanity. And many do. And I think Western culture did as well before industrialisation. Right? I think when you go back to Stonehenge and Druid culture, there was an innate earth-based respect for each other and the land. But industrialisation and everything that went with that, and the Renaissance and whatever, was about saying that money is more important than humanity. That's why I'm saying whiteness is not about race only. It's about a neoliberal set of values that we can have domination over others and over the land. And that is ultimately about fear.
I'm not saying that it's right. I'm just saying that it's the way the world works. If the answer is winning at what? The answer is they won at the competition of resource. That's why they control the resources. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It depends on who you ask. It depends on how you benefit from that. And again, I'm not looking at this as moral. It's not a moral issue. No. Moral is something we create in order to feel good about ourselves and also in order to do good things for other people. I'm just looking at it as basically Darwinian. You have groups of people, you have competition.
That's where you go wrong. Darwinian. I knew there was something in there. Darwinian.
If I just say one moment,
sure.
You cannot get this debate in Thailand anymore. I love it here. Then we can actually debate this.
Can I just ask quickly why that is?
Because we are being governed by a military coup regime.
Well, then it's the question then, do we look at, again, it's going back to, we talk about race, but it's actually about dismantling white supremacy. And then that question then falls back on white people. And it's that, do you want to give up your privilege of your racial supremacy? And I often question if white people do. Yeah. Looking at you guys. You better have paid for a ticket.
Structural in Australia, clearly not. But individuals, yes.
I mean, white people very rarely have to meditate. I mean, the fact that we're all on this panel discussing race is because we've all had to meditate on ourselves, and probably when you lived in Texas as well, about our race. We have to think of ourselves as racialised people. I don't necessarily get the sense that, like for instance, Nakkiah the other night when we were looking at, I'm just going to share a private moment with you guys, but when we were looking at the cast list of an Australian show, we were just like, what an interesting show about white people. We'd watch that, but I don't think very many other people would necessarily think of it that way. Is that one of the problems here, that whiteness isn't reflected on in a really active way? When people talk about race, they think of us, but whiteness is a race too, right?
Well, whiteness constructs us. Our privilege and our equity and our equality is based on whiteness because they construct it. So in that sense, it's really interesting to have discussions about racism, because you go, okay, does racism exist or is it white supremacy? And so often that conversation doesn't happen because it's very hard to put yourself under the microscope and say that, yes, I have privilege in my life because my race is based on being superior to someone else.
That's a really sensitive subject. When you say white supremacy or when you say white privilege, and you'll see people just like,
because, we're not clan members.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's the thing. When we... Sorry, did you...
no, go ahead.
When we're teaching medical and other health science students about Aboriginal health, they think they're coming into the room to learn about the other, about, the fascinating other. And we start by saying, no, you learn about yourself and what are your own values. And that's very confronting. And regardless of who teaches the curriculum or what is taught, there's been some really good studies shown that in first year, the standard response in medical school, and this goes for other disciplines as well, the standard response is, why do we have to learn this shit? By about third year, the standard response starts to become, oh, yeah, I think we kind of get it. And by fifth and sixth year, when they're in their clinical years or in other courses, they say, oh, thank God we learnt this stuff. So the uncomfortability and the white fragility, it's called, about talking about race, white supremacy, whiteness, of course it's uncomfortable. Of course it's confronting for all of us. But the point is that's a teachable moment. And the more that you can work with your students or whoever and keep having that conversation to get them to the next level of learning, eventually they'll have an aha moment. But that takes a big investment. And the thing is that Australia hasn't had the aha moment because we don't invest in it. We don't teach Aboriginal studies as standard in primary school. So, of course, nobody knows what race or racism or Aboriginal people are about.
If I may just offer a different experience, of course I'm not Australian, so I can't speak as an expert in racism in Australia, but I can speak of as Thailand. In Thailand, we do have a large expat community of Westerners. And since I write for the Bangkok Post, I write in English, and I speak and behave the way I do, they see me as the token Thai guy to speak for the white expat community. And they will always complain about racism in Thailand. Why Thai people are like this? Why Thai people are like that? Why are you charging us double price for a Muay Thai match or for going into a temple? Why can't we become citizens? We've been living here for 10, 20, 30 years. We are contributing to the economy. We pay tax. Why? Thai people are so racist. Well, you know why? Because it's Thailand. We have the power.
Yeah, you have the economic power.
So it's not
the rules. Yeah.
And try being of a different race in Japan. You know, so that's my point. It's not exclusive to one race. It's whoever has the power. And we are simply competing for that power. And the group that has the power want to keep and protect that power. Now, of course, my personal opinion is share as much as possible, but I'm just one man talking.
What about when those power arrangements are disrupted? When wars happen and people are displaced, when refugees move between places, when there's a crisis in Syria, when there's a crisis with Rohingya people. I'm wondering how that affects and how you've seen in your own countries how that manifests as racial tensions, for instance. What's the situation in Thailand at the moment with, for instance, the discussion about Rohingya refugees?
Well, I talked about this earlier, and I'll say the same thing again. I mean, I come from a country where we allegedly, according to report, because I want to be able to go back, allegedly, according to report, we have boatloads of Rohingya refugees coming ashore. We push them back with no food and water to die in the middle of the sea.
That sounds familiar to us.
That sound familiar? So there you go. As insofar as the Thailand's perspective on the Muslims or what's going on in the Middle East, frankly, we are too far away. We are too disconnected, and we don't have that shared historical experience. However, when Paris was attacked, everybody I knew had that Pray for Paris flag on their Facebook. And when I asked them, did you have a Lebanese flag or a Kenyan flag for the attacks earlier? People were like, no, they don't know what happened. And I don't blame them for that, because to Thai people, we have certain connection to Paris. We know French people. So we have that connection. And since I'm the editor of GQ magazine, I've been to Paris Fashion Week. So I have a connection there with Paris. So I feel for them more in comparison to Lebanon or Kenya, which we don't know anything about. So we have selective compassion simply because this is how we have been brought up. It's our historical makeup. We don't know these guys. We know these guys.
Can I pick up on a point that, Greg, you brought up about teachable moments? You're talking about teachable moments in your work. Abdul and Nakkiah, you're both artists. You're a playwright and a performer. You're a visual artist. You work in that realm. Is it fair to say that both of your drives, or one of your drives in your work, is about making teachable moments through art? And if so, what are those teachable moments?
Yeah, I think a lot of my work is challenging in that sense and gives an opportunity for a conversation, and I really sort of revel in the opportunity to talk, especially to kids, in a sort of cynical way. I think adults and older people, it's kind of too late for them. They can get stuff. But if I can get to the teenagers.
Yep.
So I try and work in schools as much as I can. Recently worked at the Parkville Juvenile Detention Facility, and we talked a little bit about that last night. But yeah, getting people when they're forming their identities, and I think having those discussions then early allows for better opportunities in the future to sort of see things a bit more evenly.
What about you, Nakkiah? Is teachable moments a motivator for you in the art that you make?
No, I don't want to teach people. I'm more interested in getting people to question things and creating space. And so, like, a lot of my work, like Black Comedy, for instance, which is a sketch show on ABC, it's an all Indigenous comedy show, and one of our like little tagline is "Black fella humour for everyone." Right? So using comedy in that instance, we're not actually trying to teach people anything. We're really just trying to make people laugh. I mean, it's silly as fuck, but excuse my language. But what that show has done is it's thrown out, little Molotov cocktails and created fires. So we're really trying to get people to think. We're trying to get them to laugh. But laughing is such a visceral response, right? So part of that is, I think, creating space for other people, like working within pop culture and entertainment. In Australia, it is so white dominated. Like, in the TV show you and I were talking about, which we will not name.
Was it Home and Away?
it's like every show.
Was it
It could be any show.
Yeah, it's the biggest thing for me, it's not so, like, I'm fascinated with white culture and white people, and a lot of my work speaks to that. But in terms of, is it for white people? Not necessarily, I don't think so. They're probably my biggest audience because they have lots of money. But let's buy my book. No. But it's about creating space for people from the other diaspora. And I think that's the most important thing that I could be doing as an artist, is creating a space that other people who aren't of the dominant power can participate in.
I'm just wondering for you guys, I mean, a kind of side effect of racism and race is often you have to be the good representative of yours, right? You have to be a good role model and ambassador for your entire community at times. Have you ever been accused of being a bad ... Voranai, have you been accused of being a bad Thai?
I have made my entire career on being a bad Thai. I'm proud to say that. And I can tell you this, at the start, when you introduced me, I did this. So what will happen is that when Thai people see this on YouTube or whatever, they will go, oh my God, he's being a good Thai, that's very good representation. And then after they hearing me talk for 5 minutes, they will go like, oh no, he's not very Thai. Thai people are not like that. He's so inappropriate. But what I've been doing as a political columnist and social critic in Thailand is really forcing Thailand to look at ourselves and examine ourselves rather than putting the blame on everyone else, see who we are and fix our problems. I'm not saying this is the same thing in Australia, but I'm just applying this to Thailand. And in doing that, and because the Thai culture is such a close-knit culture where we are not allowed to criticize ourselves, we are not allowed to look at ourselves in the mirror. When someone does that, it gets people really uncomfortable. And I have been called a bad Thai, a traitor, so on and so forth, simply because I ask people to look at ourselves and see where we are in this world. So I'm used to being the bad guy.
So you're saying that within Thai culture itself, there's an allergy to self-interrogate, to self-reflect?
Definitely. I mean, there's a group of Thai who loves it and are very progressive. But then there's another group who are more conservative, shall we say. And that's always... Two groups exist in every community. I'm going to be very Buddhist in saying this, but that's how the world works. The yin and the yang, the black and the white, the conservative and the liberals. There will always be that tug of war, that balance. And somewhere in between is the compromise. The world cannot exist without one or the other. It cannot be totally white, it cannot be totally black. And that's just the reality of it. So it's always a tug of war. This issue we'll be arguing about similar things 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, because that's how the world exists.
Nakkiah, what about you? Have you ever been accused of being a disgrace to your race? And by whom?
Well, my cousin isn't very happy at me at the moment because my boyfriend's white and she wants little, like, Aboriginal nieces, so which is very problematic in of itself. But no, I've had, from my community, I don't think anything I have to say in my work is particularly special. You know, I think my community gets behind that very much. For me, I've been accused of being a bad Aboriginal by a lot of white men. So one of the examples of that is when I wrote my very first play, which was called This Heaven, there was a review written about it in, a right-wing journal, and I doubt they even saw the show. But the criticism was Nakkiah Lui is too privileged to tell a story about Aboriginal politics. And the argument was that because I had had an education, because I had come from this loving home, and they went through my parents' financial records and then published those online, which they've yet to do with a non-Indigenous writer or artist that they've reviewed. Their whole argument was that I came from, you know, such a privileged background that somehow made me not Aboriginal.
So that's a huge problem there, where Aboriginal culture's authenticity relies or is contingent upon poverty, essentially.
Well, yes, that's it. You know, the question for me, I know I'm Aboriginal, and, you know, I knew, like, his argument was, for lack of a better word, fucked, but it was very sad to think, okay, so this is what you think an authentic Aboriginal person is. And it was someone who was illiterate. It was someone who was, you know, poverty-stricken. It was this idea of class and the effects of racism and white supremacy in this country. But that's the biggest form of racism I come across, which is my authenticity. And even as a performer, it's, you know, you're packaged as being Aboriginal. So therefore, when people buy into your package, there is something there that they're expecting that comes with this Aboriginality. So the fact that, you know, authenticity is then linked to white definition, for me, is something I'm constantly up against, and that's when I'm told that I am a bad Aboriginal from non-Aboriginal people.
Just quickly, Greg, what about you? With the work that you do, I imagine that you're held up as a role model. Do you accept that happily? Are you happy with taking up that mantle?
I wouldn't say that I'm happy with it, but I think it's a reality, just given that statistically there's not many of us that, you know, make it through to finish grade 12 and to go on to study. But I think the best way I can explain this is I don't think actually that we're arguing here. I think there's different logic that different cultures use, and I think none of us better than the other. They're just different. I was talking about this morning. Western logic, Aristotelian logic, is very much based on, you know, I think, therefore I am, and P or not P. You know, in basic psychology, basic sort of logic in Western thought is it's either black or white. It's either one thing or the other, P or not P. In many Eastern religions and cultures, not all, the logic seems to be that there is a balance of both of those, that there is black and there is white, and that you need a balance, yin and yang. Aboriginal logic is very much about all perspectives are valid and reasonable. So we don't have this thing that something's got to be right or something's got to be wrong, or something's got to be yes or no, or male or female, or what have you. You know, we don't have a law system based on guilty or not guilty. This idea of separating reality, if you will, or consciousness into just simple into a binary is part of the problem. With the world situation now, if you could be that, you know, grand. I just want to go back to the way the Native Americans explain it is they say that there are 4 basic tribes on Earth: black, white, red and yellow. That's how they explain it in some of their cultures. And they say that, and it's, you know, the north, south, east and west, and fire, air, earth and water and all of that. And they say that black people's role on Earth is about Earth, and that's our logic, and that's who we are, they're our values. That red people's, Native Americans' value is about spirit and about the North. That Western people's, Europeans, white people's, is about the mind and intelligence of a particular sort, mind only. And that Asian people's is about emotion and the value of feeling. Now, whether you believe that or not, I think it's a really interesting way to think about the world, Because what we've found, according to their prophecies, they're saying the world is unbalanced. And the reason why the world is unbalanced is because one of those parts of the circle have chosen to try and dominate and have power over the others. I don't see, back in Confucius times or whatever, China trying to colonize the world. I don't see South American cultures and Incan cultures, whatever, trying to take over and dominate Europe. I've never seen an African culture who wants to take over Australia or Asia. So I'm not saying that the problems of the world lay at Europeans' feet. What I'm saying is colonisation and its after effects is the story, intimately tied with patriarchy and intimately tied with neoliberalism. That is the story that's affecting all human beings. And I'm not saying that black, red and yellow peoples can't be discriminatory or racist to others or to themselves. What I'm saying is the basic global dynamic is one that white people have to take responsibility for their shit.
Look, I want to get over to Abdul as well, but I'm aware that we're running out of time, so I'm going to throw it out to the audience. Do we have one question back there?
Yep, hi. I've kind of got a two-part question. Oh God, everyone's turning around. First of all, just watching the dynamic between yourselves upstage, do you feel that the racism you receive, you are exposed to, you see going on in the world is altered by different personalities and how positive and optimistic they are, or how closed off a negative person can be? And secondly, something that Greg said was, you're saying about these teachings need to happen, which I think are a great idea. I know I studied Aboriginal studies in uni and it was great and, opened my mind. Do you think that Australia being so multicultural now, having so many dominant races and cultures, do you think that if we started honing on more specifics that it's going to cause further problems because more people are going to have these outcries of racism? Because why aren't you featuring my history? Why isn't there a chapter on the Vietnam War in school? And why isn't there stuff about, World War? Well, there is, but, more specifically honed to specific cultures and races.
There probably should be a chapter on the Vietnam War in schools, I reckon. And I think we're also looking at the symptoms, not looking at the structural racism. Like, if I'm a good person, or I'm a bad person, or I'm an asshole, or I'm friendly, it shouldn't matter. Like, it shouldn't be prefaced with because I'm a Muslim, or because I'm coloured, or because I'm, part Malay. That shouldn't. That's what's it's a frustrating thing. I don't know. Again, I think I'm talking to myself in circles. I'm being outgunned here. But it was, looking at the symptoms. We've got to look at the structure.
I mean, maybe I don't take my racism with a healthy dose of smile and a cup of tea. So I would say yes, maybe my, adversary to racism does affect how I receive it.
Yeah, like if I was
Is
to do...
that the question? Sorry.
If I was to hold up a convenience store on the corner, not saying that I would, but, it's... the day is young. But that might, that'd be it. Like if I was to go around a balaclava with a gun in the street, I'd be a terrorist. But otherwise, as opposed to a lone gunman or some type of psychopath. So like the being prefaced, like I don't like to cater for the racial sensibilities of the people with power.
Let's take another question from the audience. Is there one over yonder? No, you're all shy. No, one here, right up the front. And so we'll go here and then we'll go back to that gentleman.
So there was like a little bit of tension with explaining the racism sort of structures in Thailand versus, say, what we experience in Australia. Is the thing that we have to look at more about not conquered but colonised lands versus like lands that have sort of already had Indigenous people there who now all control the government structures? So, for example, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada and all that, or even all of South America, have all been invaded by Europe, and then they've created their own structures there, and then we have all this stuff that goes on now with, reconciling what's happened. Whereas I guess Thailand's, fought a lot of wars and stuff like that over its time, but is essentially the same group of people living there over a large period of time.
If I may address that, I think Thailand was colonized by the Thai people. We weren't originally from there. And I can tell you that every single country on this earth has been colonized by somebody. Every country has been built on the blood and bone of other people, and that's just a fact of life. But I do agree strongly with Greg when he said that the modern world is shaped by colonialism.
Yeah.
We are a consequence of history. We are a consequence of history, and it's the modern makeup of the world. And it's shaped by colonialism and up to capitalism today. And that's what we got to deal with. Personally, the debate going on here, personally, I don't feel that comfortable with making it a racial issue. I would rather, and it's a personal thing, make it a power issue, because that's where it's at. Who has the power? Who has the power? Who controls the resource? Everything else is, like Abdul said, it's just symptoms.
Thank you for your question. Did you have something to add, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we agree on more things than we disagree on. I think some of it is about flavour of the conversation, if you will. Going back to the multiculturalism thing, Australia's not multicultural. We don't have many dominant cultures at all in Australia. We have lots of ethnicities, and we have lots of Thai and Vietnamese and, Greek restaurants. That doesn't make us multicultural.
What's the definition? What's your definition of multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism would be, I think, far more effectual if all of those different cultures and values were allowed to be themselves and to share in power and decision-making in society. So the migrant experience is very much that when you come to Australia, over successive generations this is, that when you come to Australia you have a basic decision to make. You either have to choose to assimilate with Australian values, white Australian policy, neoliberalism, cricket and meat pies, or you don't, and you're proud of your language and culture and your food, and you take that to school in your lunchbox and you get hammered for it. So migrants in Australia are forced to make a very hard decision, which is, I'm going to keep my culture at home and in public assimilate to Western neoliberalism, or I'm going to just assimilate. I mean, that's a very hard choice, and nobody should have to make that. And Aboriginal people are forced to make that choice every day in the way that we interact with two different cultures. So multiculturalism would be far more effectual and real if we respected that other people spoke different languages. Whereas in Australia, we don't do that. We don't do that. In Australia, we think anybody's welcome here if they accept our values. And you see, the Adam Goodes example is really, really telling, because we accept Aboriginal culture, we being the country, accept Aboriginal culture if we can own and consume it, if we get to make the terms of power on how it's accepted, when and by who. And so the AFL will have Aboriginal designs on the uniforms and have Aboriginal round and, celebrate Aboriginal players. And that all looks good. That looks great. That looks like inclusion. That looks like equality and diversity. But what it's masquerading and what it's hiding is that whiteness goes unchecked. So that when Adam Goodes says, actually, I'm going to display my culture as a sign of sovereignty and social justice vis-a-vis the imaginal spear, that's not acceptable. That's not okay. And so when the AFL were forced to make a decision about how to respond to the furor over the booing, it was very telling. Their response was not clear, this is racism, it's not acceptable, it's not welcome in our game. That was not their response. Their response was, poor Adam. Isn't it terrible how he's been treated? He needs some time off. Poor Adam. So it played into the narrative that it's the Aboriginal people who've got the problem, that they're just weak, that they're just not resilient enough. So what they could have more correct, and they were more worried about their ticket sales. That was their primary objective. You cannot separate racism in Australia from neoliberalism. The AFL were concerned about their ticket sales over social justice, but they covered all of that up by having Aboriginal round. They did inclusion very well, but they did not do social justice. And we're trying to do the same thing now with constitutional recognition. So what we're really saying as a country is we'll include you Aboriginal people in our country. Subtext being, this is a white country, it always will be, we'll always make decisions, but we'll let you take part in it on our terms. That's highly offensive. On the other hand, what we should be doing is talking about equal power, So we should be talking about Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people sitting down, renegotiating what the values of this country should and ought to be, how might we share power and the articles of decision making, and then how we move forward as a nation. Aboriginal people want to move forward too, but we're not going to do that if the terms of power remain unseen and unchecked, and that white people, out of benevolence and charity and niceness, just include Aborigines when it makes them feel comfortable.
We've got time for one more question, if there is one.
Hi guys, it's a really great discussion. I had a couple of questions, but then Greg just kind of answered everything superbly. So
sorry.
I guess my question is, one of the questions is that, so we were talking about how everything is kind of like framed with the white narrative in Australia. So what can people of color do to kind of like, not necessarily to educate, but try to dismantle that structure? And what about issues of lateral violence among communities of color? Thanks.
What was the second half of the question? What was the last?
Okay, so first part of that question is, what can people of colour do or minorities do to interrogate or affect change in those power structures? Is that possible?
Be righteous, speak truth to power, kick the white butt.
You're inciting like a reverse Cronulla riot, aren't you?
Let me answer that another way. What can, if we use the gender example, what can women do, right, to deal with patriarchy, is the parallel of what you're asking. And the answer is, I presume, something about, well, actually, it's what men can do to give up their privilege. And that women should be proud. And see, the answer to all this is not just for women to get 50% of positions of power if they're going to act on male terms of power. The answer to all this is not just to get Aboriginal people into Parliament as Prime Minister if we're going to be constrained by the white terms of power that are unchecked. Cornel West makes the point very clearly in the US that you've got a black president, a black attorney general and a black minister of Homeland Security. And that's a great thing, but Black Lives Matter is proof that unless you're changing the actual terms of power on how you participate in that society, then you're not having true substantive social justice.
That's great.
Anything to add? What was the second part? The second part of your question was, sorry. Lateral violence. Oh, sorry. What was that? Okay. Any responses to the idea of lateral violence and how to address it?
Well, I mean, I don't think we should call it lateral violence, number one. I mean, we don't call white on white violence lateral violence. I think this idea of lateral violence existing within a community, I think it's symptomatic. I think, you know, when people don't have power, they try and take it off other people, and quite often that happens within their own communities. But I do think it is a symptom. So I think, you know, when we start actually going back to what Greg was saying, when those power structures start changing and those people of colour actually are part of that decision-making process and do have the equality that, you know, white people so freely have, I think that idea of lateral, like that lateral violence will change.
Thank you so much for your question. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but can you please